It's the week ending Saturday the 17th of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Sir Richard Branson become the first billionaire in space, looting and rioting in South Africa after former President Jacob Zuma was jailed, and Italy winning the UEFA European Championship. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week USA, it's Jessica Hullinger, plus we have freelancer Tomiwa Owolade, and from the excellent daily podcast The Retrospectors, Arion McNicoll. Tom, you're starting us off today. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The Cuban protest crisis.
This is a message to the world. We need to stand up, step up, but if you don't understand what's going on, then you need to wake the fuck up. Not only is this a Cuba event, a Cuba thing, this is a world event. This isn't about politics. This is about saving lives. This is about unity, not division. And bottom line, this is about taking action.
The Cuban-American rapper Pitbull, in a video released on Twitter on Wednesday. Tom, what's he talking about?
Yeah, so on Sunday, dozens of Cuban anti-government protesters were arrested by security forces following the biggest protests on the island since 1994. And the protesters were primarily shouting freedom and down with communism. In response to the protests, the president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel, has blamed the US for the turmoil, in particular the US's tight sanctions on Cuba. Mr. Diaz-Canel has said the protesters were mercenaries hired by the US to destabilize the country, and called for his supporters to defend the revolution, by which he means the 1959 revolution. There were probably two immediate factors which explain the protests, and those are economic and health reasons. So tourism, which is one of Cuba's most important economic sectors, has been devastated by the restrictions on travel as a result of the COVID pandemic. And in recent weeks, there's been a recent explosion in COVID-19 infections in Cuba. So both the combination of the economic and the health crisis has led to inflation, blackouts, and shortages of food and medicine, and also other important basic products.
And who's leading these protests, Tom? Because they did seem, according to reports in the West anyway, to kind of break out en masse spontaneously across the country, including in rural towns.
Yeah, so there's no one sort of single leader or one group that's leading the protests. I think one of the most striking aspects of this protest is that it's been largely organized through social media. I think that's one of the key elements of this protest. And it's been organized through social media as a way to sort of circumvent the tightly controlled media in Cuba. So the communist government in Cuba tightly controls all the media, and there's only one official newspaper. So as a way to organize the protest, many protesters have been using social media.
And social media, Jess, also shows the authorities clamping down on the protests, doesn't it? You know, I've seen images of what appear to be security forces detaining and beating people and pepper spraying them. I've seen audio showing bullets going off. That's now being spread all around the world as well.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think you're seeing a similar thing to what we've seen in various other parts of the world when populations protest and rebel against a government that they are fed up with, and social media really propels that, and it spreads the news globally and sort of galvanizes the movement. And I think that's why we're seeing so many people, both in the US and elsewhere, sort of their ears are perking up and they're really starting to pay attention to this.
But, Arion, do you think it is a significant moment of change? You know, as Tom was suggesting, the last protest on this scale was 1994.
I think it's big. It's going to take time to see how it plays out, to see whether it is going to be a moment of national and consequently international significance in that, you know, will it lead to some sort of regime change, or will it at least lead to concessions from the government? We're going to have to see more before we can say that. But I think it's definitely already meaningful that we're seeing this level of protest, which, you know, hasn't happened for nigh on almost 3 decades. And that in itself is substantial and worthy of reflecting on.
And Tom, there's been a sort of regime change already, though, hasn't there, in the sense that the Castros are no longer in control. Obviously, Fidel died a few years ago, but his brother Raul retired from leadership positions in April. Do you think that's had an impact on emboldening the population?
Yeah, I think so, because when we think of Cuba, we think immediately of the Castros. They identify themselves so closely with the particular communist regime that they sort of that they essentially developed a personality cult, um, and it would be very difficult for any other leader following on from that to retain that level of authority and visibility. So I do think that's definitely a factor in encouraging the population to rise up.
What do you think went wrong, Arion, in terms of COVID, though? Because when you were on the show back in April, we were talking about Cuba's vaccination program being rather impressive. Homegrown biotech that they could even sell to other countries, might even help their tourism industry.
I mean, one of the problems, I think, is that the numbers that the Cuban government has been reporting may not actually align with the reality of how many cases and how many deaths the country is seeing from COVID in reality. And I think that even though they do have these quite promising vaccines that they're now rolling out, I think that there's just this broad exhaustion within the community from the ongoing health impacts that are exacerbated by the economic problems that the island has, and that's nothing new. That's been going on for a long time. So I think that the people are fed up not just with the fallout from COVID itself, but from the years and years of of issues related to just basic subsistence. It's hard to get food, it's hard to get medication, and it's also it's hard to make your voice heard when you disagree with the direction that the government's going, because exactly what Tom was saying, it's everything in the media is so tightly controlled that you can't even speak up when you disagree with the trajectory of the country.
And some of those economic problems, Jess, it probably would be fair to blame on the US, as President Diaz-Canel has done. He called its tight sanctions on Cuba a policy of economic suffocation. The US embargo has been in place for nearly 6 decades now, so as Arion says, it's not new. But what effect do you think the US is having on what's happening in Cuba?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I definitely think that Cuba has been, or the government has been using U.S. as a scapegoat for its economic problems for quite a long time. But that's not to say that the restrictions that the U.S. has imposed are not hurting the economy, and they are. And you think about also what Trump did. So he came in and he reversed what Obama did, which he ended sort of a decades-long freeze of diplomatic ties. And then Trump came in and he said, no, we're reversing that. And he put in place some really tight travel restrictions. He tightened the embargo. He designated Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. And he also made it really difficult for family members, Cuban Americans, to send money and supplies back to their family members in Cuba, which was actually a huge economic support system. So all of that means that things have gotten much tighter for the population in recent years. And it's difficult to know exactly what should happen next. So, looking at Joe Biden, of course, he on the campaign trail said, we're going to roll back, all the things that Trump has done, and we're going to lift the restrictions, yada, yada, yada. And I think that played well on the campaign trail. But he's in a difficult position right now because on the one hand, yes, these restrictions are undeniably hurting the economy in Cuba. And if he wants to do what he says he does, which is stand with these protesters and to help lift them up as much as he can, he could lift these restrictions, which would help. On the other hand, these restrictions are actually quite politically popular in the U.S. With the demographic he might need to win, right? So obviously politics aren't the only thing at play here, but he is a politician. The Cuban Americans voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump in 2020, partially because he took such a hard stance on the government in Cuba. So it's really tricky for Joe Biden. And, does he take a political win and take a hard line here, or does he do sort of the humanitarian thing? And then there's also the problem of giving Republicans a really strong win here by letting this devolve into a migratory crisis. I mean, I think he's been sort of caught off guard here, which is evident in the fact that his press secretary does not know what to say when people ask her what his policy will be. She has said Cuba is not a priority, but clearly it is quickly becoming one.
Yeah, I think Cuban Americans really represent that split as well, don't they, Tom? I mean, you heard Pitbull there obviously being frustrated himself that he can't send money to his own people in Cuba, and even calling on Jeff Bezos, who he points out as a Cuban American, to do something and send some money. But at the same time, as Jess said, one of the reasons that Trump did surprisingly well in Florida was because of Cuban Americans and that vote which is anti-communist, people who have moved to America because they hate communism. So it's difficult to know exactly how to respond to this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there is definitely a tension between that desire on the part of many Cuban Americans to punish the communist regime, but in punishing the communist regime, they inadvertently potentially also punish the people in Cuba as well, to some extent. So it's difficult to sort of navigate that tension. But going back to the elements of social media as well, I think that's because that statement by Pitbull on Twitter was shared very widely. And one of the striking things about the statement was at the very end of the video, he said something in Spanish as well. So that's almost sort of like trying to not only communicate with the Anglosphere media, but also with the Latin American Spanish-speaking media, and particularly people in Cuba as well. So he was expressing solidarity as well through his social media platform. And I think that's one element of this particular protest that distinguishes it from earlier protests.
And there's an irony, isn't there, in the fact that Raul Castro really took these liberalizing steps to provide greater internet connectivity on the island in any case. So he's sort of partially responsible for having built the infrastructure that has then slightly come back to haunt the regime, in that now it's the space on which people are organising.
All of which said, looking at the footage of these protests, I understand they're significant because people generally don't protest in Cuba, but they seem small scale for something that's really going to change the status quo, don't they? Is this really a sort of shape-shifting moment?
I saw a really interesting piece by David Aronovich in The Times, where he was saying one of the things that you could predictably rely on as an opponent to the regime in Cuba was that if you got sent to prison for protesting, that you'd see the same couple of faces who were also protesters who had been protesting for the last however many decades. And one of the things that one of them has said, I've forgotten his name, but he said that this time round there's this whole new generation of younger people who you're seeing in prison alongside him. So, it really does speak to the fact that there might be a generational shift going on here, and that these protests actually might go somewhere. It's hard to know just yet, but it looks like it's different from the previous protests that we've seen.
One thing that certainly does look different is every single person I saw in the videos of the protests was holding a smartphone. Arion, I'm coming to you next after this. Okay, Arion, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we learnt that a growing number of people are going online to find friends without benefits.
So the way it works, like I said, it's just like a dating app. You'll swipe left on people you don't want to be friends with and swipe right on people you do want to be friends with. I feel like when you start, it feels really awkward to swipe left people you don't want to be friends with at first, because you feel bad. You're like, like I wouldn't not be this person's friend if it was in person. But you have to keep in mind, there's so many people. You don't have to be friends with everyone. That's okay.
And breathe. There's some tight audio editing going on there. YouTuber Kyra Button talking about Bumble BFF back in 2019. Arion, so Bumble is a dating app. I think we're probably all up to speed with that. Bumble BFF has passed me by. What is it?
So Bumble BFF is a place that you can go on the Bumble app or site to just make friends, platonic, ordinary, everyday friends, rather than actually finding some sort of a romantic connection. And the news this week is that a survey by the Wall Street Journal has found that a growing number of people are using dating apps like Bumble to do exactly this. They're using that feature, and just this massive number more people are going online to find friends rather than lovers. So the newspaper had spoken to 300 people and found that a third of them had used dating apps in this way, and 27% of those said that they'd done so because they were lonely during the pandemic. And it was actually mirrored over here in Britain, where that site itself, Bumble, reported this week that the Bumble BFF bit of its app has grown by 44% for women and 83%, interestingly, for men in the first 3 months of this year. So it looks like it's both a growing trend, but it's also not isolated to the US, it's international.
I do wonder, though, Jess, whether some of the numbers we're seeing, because they aren't small numbers. I've seen 39% of women surveyed saying they'd use dating to make friends, 29% of men. Some of those people ended up with platonic friendships but were seeking a romantic partner. So this would have been a date that didn't work out the way they wanted. That's a bit different, isn't it, to actively choosing platonic friendship as the thing you're looking for. Do you think that's really, really happening?
Oh, yeah, I think it's happening for sure. I mean, yeah, of course, if you go on to a dating site and you actually just end up being friends with somebody, you could say that, oh, no embarrassment here. I was just looking for a friend anyway. Like, I can see,
Right.
I can see why people would do that. But no, I think that this is actually happening. I think that that's evident in the fact that there are sections of these dating apps that are designated purely to people who want to find friends. I mean, the BFF part of the Bumble app is just for people who want to find friends. So obviously they see a market there and an opportunity for people to help fill a need that people have right now, right?
But as we just heard, Tom, from that YouTuber, it's a market for people that are going to swipe left or swipe right on a friend based on how they look. I mean, immediately, I'm not sure I'd want to be friends with anyone who is choosing me because of the way I looked, if you're not looking for romance or hookups.
Yeah, exactly. It's trying to find friendship, but using basically the same dating app method that people use to find dates. And the qualities that you would look for in a date are not necessarily the ones that you would look for in a friend as well. But I think this desire amongst people to use dating apps to find friendships is a consequence of the loneliness crisis that many people are facing. So there was a recent report in the UK by an organization called Onward called The Age of Alienation, and it found that the proportion of under 35s in the UK which say that they only have just one or no close friends has trebled in the past 10 years, from 7% to 22%. And this is particularly affecting millennials and people from Generation Z, the least likely members to participate in group activities.
And that is a stark statistic, isn't it, Arion? Does it surprise you?
I suppose it's not surprising insofar as we've all just been through this massive thing where we were confined to our houses and we couldn't go out. And so for people who maybe had just made the move to a new town or had just started a new job or for whatever reason, it just became that much harder to meet people because you weren't able to leave your house to go and meet people. So that maybe isn't surprising. I suppose what is surprising is that the trend isn't confined to the last 18 months, that it goes deeper than that. And there was a recent survey by a different organization over in the US called the American Enterprise Institute, which is also a think tank. And they found that the stats are particularly profound in men, and men since the 90s are struggling to name 6 close friends. So the number of men who could name those 6 close friends had fallen from 55% in the 90s to 27% today. And so I think that's what's interesting, is that this isn't a new thing, that it's been going on for decades.
Jess, do you think that ultimately the friends that are made through these apps can have the same depth of connection as friends that you've met in what we used to call real life?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that ultimately the way that you meet someone isn't necessarily as important to the health and success of that friendship as the work that you put into the friendship, right? And I think this has always been true. Like, if you want to maintain a friendship and you really want to get to know someone, then whether or not you meet them online or in person, you work on it. You meet up with them. You work on that connection. You nurture it. I absolutely think that they can be as meaningful. I guess what makes me a little bit sad is this idea. And this is brought on by the pandemic, certainly. I just hope it doesn't stay this way. But this idea that we're no longer meeting people through serendipity, which is such a lovely idea. And it really has, created some of the best friendships and relationships that I've had, just a sort of chance meeting. But this idea that we have to go online to find people, I hope that doesn't persist. I hope that we can that we don't unlearn the skill of getting up the guts to just go talk to somebody at a cocktail party or whatever. Like, I think that that's really important. And I think there may be something lost in this highly curated environment of online friend dating. I can't say exactly what it is, but it does feel a little bit, I don't know, sterile to me in a way, overly controlled. I don't know. But I don't know if that's any different than what online dating is like. So it's hard to say.
I know what you mean, Jess. It sort of feels as though if you go out looking for friends who are compatible in all of those traditional ways that can be written down. And it was interesting actually to look through a bunch of these YouTubers' clips, and one of the sort of consistent things that they were saying was it's really hard to know how to draw up your profile to attract friends rather than romantic connections. Because, yeah, like once you start to sort of look for people based on your shared interests or whatever, you do miss out on those serendipitous kind of people who they're a Republican when you're a Democrat, or, you know, they like, I don't know, beekeeping where you like skateboarding, and, you know, you find interest in the fact that you are different rather than that you're entirely parallel. So if you are going to set out to make friends in this way where you're looking for commonalities exclusively, then surely you're going to miss out on lots of different kinds of new opportunity.
Also, Tom, you wonder if there's a parallel. Like in the dating space, it seems to me that there's a generation coming through now that are so used to online dating and there's so much conversation around consent and how much have you been drinking and all that stuff, that actually in real life people are more reticent to approach each other flirtatiously. I wonder whether that will end up being the same for friendship, that there'll be a stigma to going up to someone and having a conversation, because that's not how you do it. You make your friends online as well.
Yeah. I think that there is that problem with online dating in some spaces, in that it does discourage that sort of spontaneous interaction that used to characterize dating beforehand, and that's definitely a risk in as Jess said, trying to turn friendship as well into this sort of curated system, trying to funnel friendship through an algorithm basically, rather than relying on spontaneity. But I think another interesting aspect of this is that in The Guardian, there was reported new research by somebody called Danu Anthony Stinson from the University of Victoria in Canada, which found that roughly 2/3 of couples actually start out as friends and they maintain a platonic relationship for long periods before sparking a romance. And this was particularly the case amongst younger people and people from LGBTQ communities. So in a sense, you could say that starting a friendship through this apps doesn't necessarily preclude possibility of future romance.
It is also worth a special mention for LGBTQ plus people. My LGBTQ plus pals have said that actually this type of meeting through dating apps has been particularly useful for them, especially if they have moved somewhere where it's hard to be open, or maybe they're not out yet. And there used to be an app called Chappy, which had a friends mode and kind of pioneered the friends mode. It's subsequently been sucked into Bumble, but apparently that was really, really useful for LGBTQ plus people to be able to make friends in ways that they sometimes had struggled to if they didn't have access to these apps.
And Jess, for one final hot take on this, I know that you've published something in the Week USA that's looking at how increased loneliness and lack of social interaction might impact our behaviours in other ways.
Yeah, definitely. There was this great piece by one of our columnists, Damon Linker, called "The Politics of Loneliness is Totalitarian." And in the piece, it's less about dating and it's more about this idea of loneliness, and especially among men. And he argues that our increasing isolation and the loneliness that follows is sort of fueling our political polarization and driving more people online towards communities that reinforce their views, particularly their radicalized political pathologies. And it's a really, really fascinating piece. And he has this amazing quote. It says, "Loneliness can be intolerable, so much so that even the most toxic forms of political association begin to look like a godsend." And I think it's just such a good point that, like, when our in-person interactions no longer fulfill the sort of almost spiritual need that we have to to be connected with others, then we look for other resources. And when that's online, the algorithm wants you to be outraged. It wants you to engage with people who maybe believe in things that are quite radical. And, you see that with especially in the States right now, I think, with, various movements. So yeah, I think it's a really lovely piece, and a bit scary, but says something.
Now, all your real life friends can be your echo chamber too. How reassuring. Jess, I'm coming to you next after this. All right, Jess, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Should dogs go bark to the office, or should they woof from home?
They're greeted with dog bones, hang out in the owner's workspace, and play with friends on the 17th floor dog park. It's estimated 7,000 dogs come to work at Amazon in Seattle.
I have a 7-year-old golden retriever. His name is Charlie. He's actually sleeping under my desk right now.
The tradition started with this dog, the first pet at Amazon.
I've never worked at a company before that you've been allowed to bring your dog to work, but it's great.
I can't imagine why we chose this story as the and finally in our running order today. Scott Swan there from 13 WTHR reporting on Amazon's office culture. Although, Jess, that report was from 2018. What's happened this week?
Yeah, so this week there is a report out from California saying that animal shelters are seeing lots of people returning their dogs that they adopted or bought during the pandemic. So, of course, we saw this big boom in pandemic puppies. People were getting dogs to keep them company while they were stuck in their homes. And now, rather predictably, a lot of people are returning their dogs as they are being encouraged to return back to normal life, and in particular, return to the office. So the report is this surge in returns of animals to the shelters that we're seeing. But the one interesting sort of spin-off of this that sort of is the crux of my story today is that dog owners seem to be hoping that their companies will allow them to bring their dogs to the office when they are allowed to go back into the office. So, for example, according to The Guardian, there was a survey of about 1,000 employees conducted last month that found that 42% of them were hoping to bring their dogs into the office.
Bringing your dog to work, though, Tom, isn't a new thing, is it? As we heard in the clip there, places like Amazon have been doing it for a couple of years, but most offices haven't. So what are the arguments against? Why doesn't everyone bring their dog to the office?
Because some people don't like dogs. Some people might be allergic to dogs. Some people might find dogs distracting. Some people may just see pets as something that you should only deal with either in the privacy of your own home or in like public spaces like parks. So some people just feel that work and leisure should be just completely segregated.
I mean, I hate to make a comparison between children and dogs, Arion, but, when people are encouraged to bring their kids to work, they're not encouraged literally to take them to their desks, are they? Because that is a distraction as a parent. The offices set up creches and nurseries to look after those children whilst mummy or daddy gets the job done. Why doesn't it work that way with dogs? What's the benefit of having the dog up against your feet under the desk rather than in a kennel downstairs?
I mean, maybe that would have to be the solution if lots of workplaces did bow to this pressure and decide to let people bring their dogs to work. Because you just can't imagine that people are going to be able to get their work done if there's a dog underfoot, or even if there's multiple dogs underfoot. I mean, the numbers alone are staggering, how many people got dogs during the pandemic. Apparently 3.2 million households in the UK alone got a pet during lockdown. So, there's that many dogs, or maybe about half that many dogs that are potentially going to come back to the office. And also when you think about that thing that Tom just mentioned about allergies are also hugely problematic, and apparently I read 10 to 20% of the population worldwide has some sort of a pet, cat or dog allergy. So that means if you work in an office with between 5 and 10 people, someone is likely to have an allergy to the animal that you're proposing to bring in. So I can only think that creches would be the solution. You can't possibly have big offices with multiple dogs lying around and expect people to be able to get on with their work.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I am someone who has an allergy to a dog, to dogs and cats. So yeah, I generally I am against this idea. But you asked Olly like what the benefit of this is, and some people like to say that there are benefits to lowered anxiety and stress levels when you are around dogs, and that being able to go over and sort of pet a dog or like play with a dog after during a stressful day or after a stressful call or whatever can like make for a happier work environment. And I gotta be honest, I just do not like by that argument, because I sort of feel like if companies want their employees to be less stressed and happier, they should find better solutions. Like you can offer more time off or, better salaries or, other perks that don't involve, inflicting allergies and dog fears and potential dog bites and stuff on your coworkers. I just find it a little bit of a cop-out, that argument.
Well, okay, you might find it a cop-out as an argument, but Tom, I don't know if you've ever worked in a place, as I have, where there's sort of like an office cat, or, a dog that, lives next door. And when it pops around, it clearly does make everyone happier. I'm not talking about people bringing in pets, but the presence of animals does lower anxiety and does make people happier. That seems unquestionable, doesn't it?
Yeah, to some extent it does. Yeah, it can really boost morale. And I think another aspect of this is that with many people going back to work after the lockdown and the pandemic, many people will feel regret at having to leave the recently bought dogs back at home. And dogs are very sociable creatures. They depend on being loved and being interacted with. So leaving them back at home is not good for the well-being as well. Cats, less so. Cats can probably live back at home respectably, but not with dogs. So there's that element of personal regret and trying to reconcile going back to work.
And I think that's another obvious benefit, that if you're talking about if the options are either bringing your animal to work or putting it down, as Jess was saying, there's this sort of rise in numbers of people doing that, then surely that is one obvious benefit, that this is not going to lead to a whole mass of doggy executions, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, but hold on, that isn't a corporate responsibility, is it? That people's employees have gone out and got dogs and now aren't responsible enough to find an alternative apart from killing them. I mean, if you go and get a pet, you should know when you get the pet that you have to look after it for life.
Right, but if you're thinking about the pros and cons of different sorts of things that we can do from this point on, knowing that we've already acquired that many extra million animals and brought them into our world, then if you're choosing between putting them down or finding a way to bring them to work, then surely bringing them to work has to be the lesser of those two evils.
I mean, surely the best middle ground here is to just let people work from home when they want to. Like, let people hang out with their dogs at home. Don't make them come into the office if they don't have to. I think this is less about people wanting to bring their dogs in and more about not wanting to go into the office, probably. And I think also, I don't think a lot of companies are going to do this. For one, I think it's actually bad for the company. If you think about the time and the money and the energy they will have to spend to make sure that the dogs that they're bringing in are safe and friendly and not going to bite someone, like the legal stuff here is it's a bit tricky. You have to get insurance and stuff for dog incidents. And also, I agree that I think productivity would probably go down. So I don't think we'll see this. And I completely agree with you, Olly, about this idea that we should not be pandering to people who were irresponsible and made rash decisions during the pandemic to buy animals that they didn't realize maybe they wouldn't be able to take care of later down the line. And I know I'm going to get a lot of hate for this because I'm going to sound like a dog hater, but I think that actually if you get a dog, you should be able to provide for it always. That is my strong opinion.
I've hosted this show, Tom, for over 230 episodes now, and the mission statement is to try and find stories that are under the radar that have implications for all our lives. And this seems like a frivolous story, but it seems to me that the bigger story under this and under a lot of things we've talked about for obvious reasons over the last year is about working from home. Like, for the people who are listening to this show who have the kind of jobs where they're able to work from home generally, that actually, if you're being honest, is the biggest shift, isn't it? That is the thing that in the last 5 years definitely has changed. We're seeing it change around us. There is no going back from this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's desire to work from home. That's the biggest shift. And also that I think another related issue is the conflation between work and leisure. So when we associate looking after dogs or getting dogs, it's a leisure activity essentially, but it also requires work as well. And in working from home, whilst also looking after your dog, there is that sense of conflation between those two things, which I think is one of the interesting things that workplaces will have to deal with in the future.
Arion, have you ever worked at a place where there's a dog?
No, I haven't. I've stayed in hotels that have had a kind of a local in-house dog, and I quite like that actually. But that's a very specific thing because it's a sort of home-from-home experience. But no, I've never worked in an office with a dog.
I once worked in an office. It was actually the Week's office in New York years ago, where one of the people on the magazine had a bunny that he brought in. It was very strange. It was so weird.
That's a way of marking yourself out as an eccentric, it seems to me, rather than anything to do with the
Absolutely.
rabbit. It's like, oh, the guy with the bunny. Yeah, I've met him.
Yeah, I don't remember his name, but I remember thinking that it was very weird that he had a bunny.
I always like it when I go for a meeting and the person has a dog like asleep in a basket in the corner. I always find that quite relaxing. And also I should say, like in radio presenting, there is a staggering number of local radio presenters that have dogs asleep at their feet when they're presenting shows that they train not to bark.
That sounds risky.
Yeah.
And Andrew Neil used to have a dog when
Yes,
he had his
that's
BBC
right. Yeah,
show.
on This Week he did indeed. Yeah, I think it's a sense of identifying with the audience. You know, people are at home, they're relaxed. You want to try and make your studio feel relaxed as well. I think that's the idea. Anyway, be quiet, Fido. We're doing the show. Okay, that is it for this week. Treats all round to our top dogs, Jess, Tom, and Arion. And Arion, you're going to be back next week playing the part of Olly Mann, I understand, whilst I'm on holiday.
I'll be doing my best. I can't make any promises that I'll pull it off.
I'll send you thorough notes. Remember, you can follow this show for free. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And as I said, I'm off on holiday for a couple of weeks, so I'll see you then. Arion will be here to unwrap next week. Until then, bye-bye.